You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
I want to welcome you all to this Geneva lecture. My name is Ed Larman. I'm the director of Geneva Campus Ministry. There's a little more information on the table about Geneva, and later on we'll make you more aware of how you can be involved in our events if you'd like. This is the 83rd Geneva lecture by my count. Since 1976, we have brought Christian scholars, artists, and professionals from a wide variety of fields to share their work and their insights with the campus and the wider community. Our speaker in the fall of 2012 was artist Makoto Fujimura. And he made the comment that just as we have learned that we need to nurture the physical soil on which we depend for life, we also must nurture the cultural soil from which comes the community life on which we depend. And especially in a time of polarization, violence, fear, mistrust, and all the other ills which beset our country and the world, I think it's a powerful message that we need to nurture the cultural soil. Geneva Campus Ministry and the members of the Geneva Lecture Series believe that the Christian faith has the potential and the responsibility to help nourish the cultural soil for the flourishing of all. For we believe that God created all things and is about the restoration of all things through Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. I'd like to thank the Geneva Lecture Series Committee, which is listed in the brochure that you received, and Ministry Coordinator Catherine Damisch, who does a lot of the legwork and all of the tech work and creative work that goes into this. Our contributors listed on the brochure, including unnamed individuals on whom we rely very heavily for this series. I'd like to thank City Channel 4 for taping this event for later broadcasting, and welcome to those of you who may watch in the future, maybe at 3 in the morning or whenever it is. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Lori Branch. Lori hails from Texas. She went to Harding University in Arkansas, the University of Memphis, and got her PhD at Indiana University. So she's been gradually inching her way north. We hope she doesn't go any farther north because we want her to stay here. She's an associate professor of English literature at UI in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and has taught here since the year 2000. Lori's scholarly interest has ranged from the 4th century Desert Fathers to the Twilight Saga, but she's focused primarily on restoration and 18th century British literature, religion and secularism, literary theory, and theology. Her first book, Rituals of Spontaneity, Sentiment and Secularism from Free Prayer to Wordsworth, was named the 2007 Book of the Year by the Conference on Christianity and Literature. In the years 2010 to 2012, she was a member of the Mellon Working Group on Religion and Literature at the University of Notre Dame. And since then, she has been a series editor for the Literature, Religion, and Postsecular Studies series at the Ohio University Press. And I think about 9 volumes have been published so far, something like that. Lori has a very long resume of scholarly articles and presentations, awards, and service to her discipline, her university, and the community. Currently, she's at work on a book entitled Postsecular Reason and Anti-Manifesto. We're looking forward to seeing that. Dr. Branch was instrumental in helping to found St. Andrew's Antiochian Orthodox Church in Iowa City. St. Raphael. St. Raphael. St. Raphael's Antioch and Orthodox Church in Iowa City. And actually, I was a little nervous about asking her for this date because they just had Orthodox Easter 2 days ago, and but we're glad that she's here. And Lori is a faculty advisor, the faculty advisor for the Orthodox Christian Fellowship, the church's ministry to University of Iowa students, and faculty advisor of the InterVarsity Graduate Christian Fellowship. She and husband Robert Peterson have twin daughters, Nina and Nicole, now 8 years old. And in her spare time, she and Robert homeschooled them. So that tells you just a little bit about some of the things Lori does. It doesn't really capture who she is, and I'm sure that I can't do that either. But when I think of Lori, I just mentioned 3 words. First is intelligence, and you'll very quickly see what an intelligent person she is. But secondly, she is passionate. Her commitment to her scholarship, her family, her church, her students, to truth, to social justice, and above all, to her Lord, is powerful. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with growing up in Texas, but I tell you, this lady with a warm smile and a ready laugh and readiness to hug has some fire in her belly. But the third word is kind. Lori's a wonderful inspiration to her friends and all who know her, and a respectful dialogue partner with those who disagree with her. By the grace of God, that fire in her Texas belly has been kind of channeled, I think, to warm us all. Or maybe to return to Fujimori's metaphor, she uses her intelligence, passion, and kindness to nurture the cultural soil on which society depends. So it's my really sincere honor and privilege to present Dr. Lori Branch, who will speak on the religious turn, post-secular approaches for literature and the humanities.
Most of the time I think of myself as a recovering Texan. Just for the record. Make of that what you will. I want to thank Ed and the lecture series for inviting me here. I think the Geneva Lecture Series does such a great work for the whole university, and it's just really a privilege to get to be here with you all and share this evening together, share some of my thoughts about the religious turn, post-secular approaches for literature and the humanities. In 2007, the Association of American Publishers made the perhaps surprising decision to award their prize for Best Professional and Scholarly Book in Mathematics to a novel. That novel was A Certain Ambiguity by Gaurav Suri and Hartosh Singhbal, and it was published by Princeton University Press. And judging from the largely, though not exclusively, enthusiastic reviews the novel received from mathematically inclined readers, it's not hard to see why. The story concerns a math major at Stanford University, Ravi Kapoor, who, to the horror of his family back in India, jeopardizes his 4-year business major graduation plan by immersing himself in a math course on infinity taught by the charismatic professor Nico Aliprantis. In so doing, Ravi revives his childhood love of the wonder of mathematics, which had been nurtured in him by his mathematician grandfather, Vijay Sani. But in his studies with Nico, the two stumble across an article by the grandfather, Sani, with a tantalizing footnote indicating that during an academic trip to New Jersey in 1919, he was imprisoned, and they later discover tried for blasphemy. Ravi's journey into the paradoxes of infinity, uncertainty, and non-Euclidean geometry with Nico parallels his research into this blasphemy trial, the extensive documents for which include the transcripts of his grandfather's extensive interviews with the mathematically inclined Christian judge, Judge Taylor, who's set to determine if his case should go to trial. In the course of their many heated discussions, they both proclaim, as do many characters in the novel, their passionate pursuit of rational proof as a route to absolute certainty in the quest for meaning. Both are shocked into questioning their entire worldview, however, when, in the midst of their pretrial meetings, they read news reports in May 1919 of the British astronomer and physicist Sir Arthur Eddington making observations of a solar eclipse that demonstrate the effects of gravity on light and confirm Einstein's theory of general relativity, effectively showing occasions when Euclidean geometry doesn't hold true. And now I ask myself, a stunned Sani says to an equally bewildered Judge Taylor in the transcripts, if deductions from Euclid's axioms lead to propositions that are not only uncertain, but also possibly untrue, then how can we know anything at all? No axiom is safe. If no axiom is safe, then no deduction is possible. Sani and Judge Taylor forge what becomes a lifelong friendship when they both have to moderate their demands for proof, when they realize that belief investment is inescapable at the foundation of their worldviews. For Taylor, his belief in God, and for Sani, his belief in the reality and consistency of mathematics. I cannot believe that something so beautiful can be untrue, he ultimately confesses to Taylor. But this is not something I have proof for. In my undergraduate honors seminar in Postsecular Studies this semester, we read Suri and Ball's novel, and my wonderful students, many of whom are here tonight, were quick and right to bemoan the novel's many literary failings and shortcomings of prose style. But their passionate discussion of the novel's central themes, and some of them are writing final projects on this novel, underlined exactly what energizes so many reviewers of the novel: the vivid connection between seeking to know truth and hungering for meaning, between knowledge and belief, and the way that Ravi undergoes an experience at the end of the 20th century not unlike his grandfather at its beginning, which Ravi describes as confronting the loss of his universality and absoluteness. It is indeed amazing, Ravi tells us. The human experience is such that we yearn to find something lasting and true, something that speaks to our own hearts and has meaning. Meaning, however, whatever its variety, seems to demand faith. A certain ambiguity can serve as a fittingly interdisciplinary icon of the religious turn in the academy in the last 20 years, which dates to the mid-1990s in philosophy. Hans de Vries's Philosophy and the Turn to Religion, which was published in 1999, was an early monograph that connected threads in the works of Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Luc Marion, and Jacques Derrida, which de Vries argued shared a new openness to religion and a recognition of similarities between deconstruction and negative theology. In 2000, the Marxist philosopher and atheist psychoanalytic social theorist Slavoj Žižek published a book titled The Fragile Absolute, or Why the Christian Legacy is Worth Fighting For, his first of half a dozen monographs on religion. At the American Academy of Religion meeting in Toronto in 2002, in the wake of the publication of his collected Acts of Religion, Derrida filled a ballroom with 2,000 eager listeners who, as philosopher John Caputo puts it, were not people who came to hear about the death of God. The desire of God would be much better. The new avenues of interest in religion de Vries identified might be said to have culminated in Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, published in 2007, a nearly 900-page account of the intellectual and social changes by which secular materialism became the immanent frame through which many Western people experience the world. Though not uncontested, Taylor's magnum opus demonstrated the interdisciplinary power of its account, not least in the vibrant Social Science Research Council Internet Forum, The Immanent Frame, named after his idea, which was founded the same year. On the occasion of Derrida's death in 2004, literary critic Stanley Fish quite famously predicted in the Chronicle of Higher Education that religion would, quote, succeed high theory and the triumvirate of race, gender, and class as the center of intellectual energy in the academy. And in departments of English, there have been developments parallel to those that de Vries documented, especially post 9/11, though they fall far short, we must say, of constituting Fish's center of intellectual energy. Since the mid-2000s, we've seen award-winning monographs across a wide range of literary historical fields, approaches, and presses on topics ranging from medieval affect and Reformation book studies to the religiousness of Bakhtin and Auden. There are also flourishing new monograph series in this area, including Bloomsbury's New Directions in Religion and Literature, Ohio State University Press's Literature, Religion, and Postsecular Studies, and Baylor University Press's impressive list across several series. The three major scholarly journals dedicated to literature and religion, that would be Religion and Literature, Literature and Theology, and Christianity and Literature, have all experienced important revivals and expansions in this period. In London, in July of 2011, all three journals collaborated for the first time in staging the international conference, The Hospitable Text, New Approaches to Religion and Literature, at which the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, gave a moving keynote lecture on Marilynne Robinson's Gilead and Home. It was a fun party at which to be an Iowan. That was really great. I got to talk with him about Marilyn afterward. And the next year or two will see the publication of three major collaborative projects. The products of the Mellon Working Group on Religion and Literature, which will appear in a soon-to-come-out volume of Religion and Literature, the journal, and both the Rutledge and Cambridge Companions to Literature and Religion, all of which testifies to a fertile field under ample cultivation. The curious fact, then, is that the religious turn, however vibrant and prolific, has yet to generate the kind of sea change that feminism and the new historicism, for example, worked in our discipline in previous decades. And so before we go on to talk further about what this new post-secular scholarship will or should or does look like, we do well to spend some time ruminating on why that is. Many scholars have pointed out that the slowness of the field of literary studies to warm to post-secular approaches, relative to other fields, is due to the secular constitution of literary studies itself. American religious and literary scholar Tracy Fessenden writes, "The legitimating narrative of literary scholarship assumes that it was once religious, became less and less so with the march of knowledge, and is now decidedly secular." This is still Fessenden. "Of all binaries to which critical suspicion directs our disciplined scrutiny, the secular religion binary is last to yield to critical pressure because it lies closest to the heart of professional identity." Acknowledging the painful pertinence of a critique of secularism for literary studies, Laura Levitt claims that a willingness to engage with this discomfort is a mark of what post-secular criticism does. Such a criticism is about opening up the cracks in a still presumptively secular literary criticism. This secularism, then, is the crucial context for a genuinely emergent post-secular studies. And it brings us to one of the most important ideas about post-secular scholarship, that it unavoidably takes as its object religion and secularism in literature and the culture at large, but also in intellectual scholarly presumptions about religion and secularity, faith and knowledge. In my contribution to the proceedings of the Mellon Working Group, an essay titled "The Rituals of Our Resecularization, Literature Between Faith and Knowledge," I give an account of the particular secularity of my discipline. My claim in that essay is that the disciplinary study of literature in the university setting has been characterized by a very particular sort of secularism, dominated by the distinction between faith and knowledge as it came to be understood in the early modern and modern periods, such that literary study is valued in terms of the production of knowledge, and any association with the epistemologically lesser category of faith or belief makes literary study suspect. The secularism of our discipline confesses its disavowed but ineradicable religiousness, though, in the ritual by which it cyclically must reinvent its claims to secularity. So in this first portion of my paper, I'm going to sketch a brief version of this thesis about the rituals of our resecularization, its kind of history of the discipline, and its implications here. And I'll just say as an aside while I grab my water, that I think that this kind of disciplinary history is enormously important. There's Danielle Arvieu-Leger's wonderful history of the discipline of the sociology of religion at the opening of Religion as a Chain of Memory. It's really important for us to understand how our disciplines got to the place that they are today and what role secularism as an ideology plays in the constitution of those different disciplines. So, high-speed tour of the history of the English discipline. Perhaps our most paradigmatic text for understanding the tensions between literature, knowledge, and belief in Western cultures is Plato's Republic. With its parables of the sun, the cave, and the divided line, it's the ur-text of Western epistemology, setting out for us the loftiest aspirations of the mind to knowledge, or he episteme, certain intellectual possession through vision and proposition, mathematics and dialect, of the truth of what is, as opposed to ignorance, which pertains to what is not. Between knowledge and complete ignorance lies doxa, or opinion, which may vary on a spectrum from illusion, or aikasia, to belief, pistis. But in the Republic, the line between episteme and doxa is divided hard and fast. In Book 10, the clear implication is that poetry belongs to aikasia and constitutes only the perception of the darkest shadows and murkiest reflections of reality. It's not just in light of the long-standing Platonic denigration of poetry that the emergence of academic literary study necessitates an effort to establish literature and the study of literature as forms of knowledge, or sciences even. Gerald Graff's Professing Literature and Institutional History, which first came out in 1987 and then came out in a wonderful second edition in 2007, 20 years later, Graff's Professing Literature helps us understand this process on the institutional scale, providing a standard account of the rise of the discipline of English in the latter 19th century United States. In Graff's account, several threads contributed to the emergence of the academic study of English. The broader sea change was the rise of the middle classes and the subsequent perceived lack of pertinence of studying Latin and Greek. But there were also institutional developments, such as the 1873 change in the famous Harvard composition course, which institutionalized the study of standard English authors, such that by the 1890s, most U.S. colleges included standard works of English literature on their written entrance examinations. But more significant for the formation of the discipline than either these changing attitudes about the classics or the Harvard composition requirement was the founding of Johns Hopkins University in 1876, and the subsequent rise of the research university in the United States. Johns Hopkins was a modern university built from scratch, as it were, by a huge endowment from its eponymous Baltimore entrepreneur philanthropist. Its trustees hired Daniel Coit Gilman as its first president, and Gilman modeled Johns Hopkins on his understanding of the modern European universities, decreeing that it should be secular and that its power would reside in one endeavor, faculty research. The university would open its own press, and faculty members' accomplishments would be embodied in their scientific treatises and publications in peer-reviewed journals. This empirical vision called for specialized departments and courses of study, and it was only after the founding of Johns Hopkins that American universities began to have academic departments after the German model, with disciplinary specialization and administrative autonomy. It's fair to say that this professionalization of the university created our disciplines as we know them today. But this imperative to produce original research and publications as the measure of knowledge did not sit well in the new field of English literature. It was, in fact, the source of the original controversy that shaped English as a discipline. The conflict graph describes as the investigators versus the generalists, which raged among the professors in the new discipline between 1876 and 1930. The investigators took the Johns Hopkins model as their guide. They saw their job as discovering the laws of philology and grammar and the facts of literary history just as surely as a physicist describes the force of friction or gravity. And they dismissed earlier forms of literary appreciation as sentimental and unrigorous. The generalists, on the other hand, thought something important was lost in this newly scientific way of reading literature. And amassing facts about literature, its real value, they thought, was lost. No clear picture of the meaning of literature emerged, and even when they could not agree on what that significance was, the generalists were disgruntled by the reduction of literature to a heap of empirical data. At stake in this contest between appreciation and analysis was precisely a science of literature, the status of literary study as a scientific, research-oriented production of knowledge. The winners of this conflict were the innovating new critics, who reigned from roughly 1930 to 1960, who sought to combine intellectual analysis with an appreciation of literary meaning. In many ways, the new critics combined the best of both worlds. They sought to hold literary study to the high intellectual standards of the investigators, and yet also to have it be meaningful and accessible to students, retaining the humanist generalist appeal. So while standard introductions to criticism and theory typically teach students that American new criticism was anti-scientific and interested in the non-rational dimensions of art, that in no way indicates that their way of reading was irrational or anti-intellectual. Even when the new criticism articulated the value of literature in terms of paradox, as Cleanthe Brooks famously did, it did so in the service of a science of literature, of quantifying literary knowledge in terms of the publication ethos of the research university. In the discipline's next major paradigm shift in the 1970s and 1980s, it was the practitioners of critical theory and political criticism who had a stake in legitimating themselves over and against the new critics. And they did so, as the often rehearsed story goes, by indicting what they deemed the thinly veiled religiousness smuggled into literary study by the new critics under the guise of its largest, seemingly neutral existential terms and themes. But what is far more significant than the ersatz or erstwhile religiousness of the new critics, so decried by their successors, is the ignored secularism of the new critics' crucial intellectual maneuver. That is, they're transforming the ostensibly emotional and uncertain faith of their scholarly imparental forebears through a process of scholarly alchemy into the hard facts of form and concrete universals. Their study of literature was legitimated as a form of knowledge that science cannot give us, but one produced by a very scientific method of careful scrutiny, not of material reality, but of literary language and form. This is why, in an astounding inversion that the profession has largely forgotten, the new criticism was brought to task in the 1960s by different camps, both for being too religious and for being too secular and scientific. On the one hand, as Edward Pickering tells it in The Roots of the New Criticism, in order to elevate the opposition to science above the level of a merely desperate emotional reaction, John Crow Ransom, the new critics, developed the notion that poetry taught unique knowledge. And the new criticism drew fire not so much for its religiousness at that time, but because it marched under an epistemological flag so militant as to be alienating. But the ironies of this inversion run even deeper. At the same moment that the new criticism was being shunted aside as both too rationalistic and too religious, it was faulted in other quarters for being insufficiently religious and even a-religious. J. Robert Barth, in an aptly titled 1973 Harvard English Studies essay, A Newer Criticism in America, The Religious Dimension, could acclaim the rise of the new Chicago-style study of religion and literature that was emerging at that time as filling a void left by a new critical failure, a rationalist failure to read the religious content of texts and to register their religious contexts. Barth enthused over what he took to be the newer criticism that would remedy this lapse. The work of the Conference on Christianity and Literature, academic meetings at Drew University and Boston College, and the then new monographs on religion and literature by Nathan Scott, M.H. Abrams, J. Hillis Miller, and others. For all their differences in methodology, to Barth's eye, these scholars shared having left behind the false ideal of artistic autonomy that bewitched some of the later followers of the new criticism, defining the poetic text not simply in terms of itself, but in terms of its larger context as well, a context which stands outside the poem. But, as if prophesying unawares the direction the next 4 decades of literary study would take, Barth chides a young critic he otherwise admires for failing to admit that poetic symbols can reach from words towards a transcendent reality. This is Barth's language here. One occasionally finds this problem even in so good a critic as J. Hillis Miller, who's quite young at that time, whose treatment of Gerard Manley Hopkins ultimately fails because it does not accept the possibility that Hopkins really did, as he so often asserts in his reflections on his own work, find the transcendent God in his creation, end quote. And you have to say Hillis Miller's deconstructive sort of criticism was certainly the real wave of the future, the newer criticism that was coming. It's crucial to appreciate, then, the precise position the new criticism seemed to occupy at this particular moment in the early 1970s. From one point of view, Barth could recognize quite rightly its profound lack of anything like a religious sensibility, and at the same moment, the mainstream of the profession was poised to reject it in the manner I am arguing is characteristic of all its major paradigm shifts, faulting its fuzzy, quasi-religious worship of the literary and valorizing a newly rational approach to the study of literature, what I am calling the ritual of our disciplinary resecularization. The discipline's disavowal of belief was indeed taken to a new level in what Jeffrey Galt Harpham has called the theoretical era, circa 1968 to 87. Despite the fall of the reign of theory with a capital T into what Jennifer Howard has described as the general ethos of theoretical eclecticism, it is still largely the universe of critical theory with its abiding materialism and secularism that's the governing spirit of literary study today. The operative assumption is most often that religious faith is discredited and precluded by a commitment to the evident truths of critical theory as they are borne out in literature, be they Marxist, Frankfurt School, feminist, psychoanalytic, sex and gender-related, national, racial, or other truths. Seen from another angle, it's perhaps because the claim of literary study to scientific knowledge has always felt somewhat tenuous that these mainstream schools of criticism stand aloof from the mathematics student Ravi's revelation that meaning seems to demand faith. Laura Levitt, professor of religion, Jewish studies, and gender, and director of the Women's Studies program at Temple University, marvels at how difficult it is, still in 2010, when she was writing, to read for religion in contemporary literary criticism. This is a longer quote from Levitt. In literary studies, there's a great deal of suspicion surrounding engagement with any expression of religion whatsoever. Religion continues to carry the taint of abjection. It's primitive, outmoded, and dangerous, a symptom of a kind of Enlightenment supersessionism. Given this, and this is a portion I quoted more briefly before, given this, a willingness to engage with this discomfort is a mark of what post-secular criticism does. Such a criticism is about opening up the cracks in a still presumptively secular literary criticism. This still presumptively secular literary criticism, as Levitt identifies it, has more in common with Plato's idea of episteme than most practitioners in our field would perhaps be willing to admit. However critically aware or savvily deconstructive most of us as literary critics consider ourselves to be, these secular truths of materialism operate as propositional statements of what is, as opposed to ignorance, especially the ignorance of problematical political and religious ideologies, often treated as coterminous, which pertains to what is not. From within the linguistic turn and a variety of critical theories in the 1990s and early 2000s, however, certain segments of our discipline reach something approaching Ravi's connection between meaning and belief, through the recognition that language is at every point porous to faith, even as it aspires to knowledge. That language's knowledges are at every turn supported by and rely upon faith and upon the believing, meaning-making subject who ever moves between worlds of things and thoughts, matter and meanings, bridging the gap between word and thing in particular ways. The questions of the meaning of living and of the cosmos are just that, true questions posed by what sociologist Christian Smith, in previous Geneva lecture studies lecturer, by what sociologist Christian Smith has aptly called the linguistic, moral, believing animal, who consciously and in reality encounters and raises those questions. These true questions inescapably entail dialogue with others and creative engagement with their experiences and with one's own existential experiences. This is the way in which meaning is made and is artful and poetic in the sense of poesis, not ex nihilo, but humanly, consciously, linguistically, relationally. This wedging between faith and knowledge is ground zero for the convergence between religion and literature and for post-secular studies and the humanities more generally. So, having traced briefly the emergence of the religious turn in the context of a complex and long-standing academic secularism in the pursuit of an ostensibly scientific sort of certainty, which is certainly not particular to the discipline of English, in the second half of this talk, I want to gather together what I take to be the strongest and most promising insights of the religious turn, and to suggest how they can serve as the basis for a scholarship that does something besides renew its claim to knowledge through its ritual resecularization. In this spirit, I offer 7 premises of post-secular scholarship, drawn from sociology, philosophy, anthropology, history, and literary studies, premises that I believe can inform a genuinely post-secular scholarship within not just literary studies, but the humanities at large. Excuse me while I get another drink. So the first premise would be revisions of the secularization thesis. Built on work by Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, the secularization thesis gained traction in sociology in the mid-20th century as an account of the declining importance of religious institutions in modernity. An explanatory model and a research program, it asserted that the social significance of religion diminishes due to 3 aspects of modernity: social differentiation, societalization, and rationalization. The normative force of the secularization that the secularization thesis accrued in the latter 20th century in academia was hegemonic. As French sociologist Daniel Arvillage recounts, as late as the 1980s, initiation into the sociology of religion, quote, essentially meant embarking upon an analysis of the reasons explaining the decline of religion as a defining feature of the modern world. But today, as she puts it, the entire research landscape is astonishingly changed, for reasons including the paradigm's failure to explain global phenomena, from the rise of religious fundamentalisms and new and traditional religions to the persistent religiosity of U.S. culture. Even scholars who agree that religious institutions declined in importance over the last 500 years significantly revise secularization theory's claims, methodologies, and definitions. Scholars also point out that the presumption of secularization has skewed accounts of literary, artistic, and philosophical history, privileging skeptical perspectives as the voices of progress. Such revisions are usefully designated post-secular because they challenge the theory's most secularist aspects, namely the presumption of secularization's inevitability and its equation to rationality. Such accounts of secularization Charles Taylor calls subtraction theories, and a crucial upshot of a secular age is to show how contingent and uninevitable the construction of a secular materialist immanent frame in Western modernity actually was. The deeper significance of secularization for Taylor is not so much a decline in belief as a transformation in the cultural intellectual context in which belief takes place. In Taylor's account, from religious belief being normative and naive to being, as it is today, one often embattled option among other versions of human flourishing. Freed of the secularization thesis over determination, post-secular scholarship opens onto myriad accounts of the construction of secular perspectives and subjectivities, and what Daniel Villaget calls the transformation of religion and modernity and dialogue with those secular perspectives. So the second premise for postsecular studies is the recognition of secularism as an ideology. To view secularism as an ideology admits that it has operated as an invisible and insufficiently examined set of assumptions. The wealth of scholarship in this vein has prompted Tracy Fessenden to call academics to, in her words, begin seeing secularism, which has been previously kind of invisible, to begin seeing secularism, its modalities in law, education, technology, citizenship, how it positions subjects, what kind of good it does and what kind of good it may undo, how far from being universal and disinterested, it picks up certain strands and conspicuously drops others from the religions it aims to emancipate or displace. It has been scholars from geographies to which Western secularism was exported during colonialism and imperialism that have had the keenest eyes for the particulars of this ideology. For Talal Asad, at stake in transcultural colonial relations is the imposition of an entire secular discourse of being human, central to which are ideals, for instance, of individualism, detachment from passionate belief, objectivity, skepticism, autonomy, and what Assad calls a utilitarian calculus of pleasure and pain, in which there is no way of engaging suffering positively but to minimize it. Rather than a view from nowhere, this perspective is the view from Western Europe in Assad's reckoning, the singular product of a rationalistic Protestant Catholic dialectic in Western modernity. Like Fessenden, Michael Warner advocates seeing secularism as a specific cultural formation in its own right, with its own sensibilities, rituals, constructions of knowledge, and ethical projects. And he suggests that secularism resists critical analysis because it's so interwoven with our ideas of academic work and critique. Secular culture remains understudied because, in his words, one of its features is the consolidation of religion as an object of social scientific knowledge in a way that takes for granted the secular character of explanation itself. Graham Ward's genealogy of English secularism in his wonderful book, True Religion, is especially potent in locating economic profit at the center of its logic. In his account of the monarchy's gradual eclipse of the power of the church in Spain and England, political philosophies invoked religion in early bids for legitimation, only to cordon it off from a newly secular world order soon to be dominated by imperial consumerist logics. A line of argument also advanced by scholars as different as Michael Kaufman, Russell McCutcheon, Timothy Fitzgerald, and others. Such analyses provide warrant for examining the workings of secularism in history, in literary texts, and in critical practice. Such critique moves away from the assumptions both that the secular order will covertly support my rationalized belief system, which has been the problematic legacy of the Protestant separation of church and state in the United States and which is currently unraveling, and two, that persons or the public sphere should or could ever be without belief, the secularist assumption, towards three, a deliberate secularity, more on the Indian model, predicated on the multiple religiosities of its citizens, protecting religious liberties rather than tolerating or closeting them, and as Jürgen Habermas suggests, benefiting from lively dialogue with varieties of religious interlocutors. The third premise is the limitations of critique. In the last decade, critiques of critical reason and its subjectivities have emerged from many quarters, disdaining the obvious in order to probe the infinite mysteries of the unsaid, as Rita Felsky puts it. The hermeneutics of suspicion promotes a sensibility, she says, that prides itself on its uncompromising wariness and hypervigilance. As she describes it, the process of humanities training and of becoming a critical reader means precisely moving from attachment to detachment and indeed to disenchantment. Faced with this prospect, many of her students reject the academic culture of critique, she says, because the theories they encounter are so excruciatingly tongue-tied about why literary texts matter, offering only a critical deflation of the reasons rather than a searching engagement with them. The handmaiden of the hermeneutics of suspicion and the invisible norm of humanities inquiry, Michael Warner points out, is critical reading. At its heart, critical reading entails what he calls techniques of distantiating knowledge. And so of distancing the self. Techniques of distantiating knowledge, specifically the rigorous extraction of oneself from the ethical demands of direct textual address. It's a really important idea. That's what we teach students to do when we teach them critical reading, to remove themselves from the ethical demands of direct textual address. Warner demonstrates that unacademic modes of reading, especially religious ones, are by no means necessarily uncritical or unreflective, and one of the weightiest ramifications of his essay is the implication of critical reading in secularism's invisible religiosity. He calls it the pious labor of a historically unusual sort of person, which inculcates particular pieties and beliefs. Critical and religious modes of reading both maintain forms of subjectivity. Critical reading is distinguished by its disavowal of belief and its misrecognizing of itself as universal reason. The recognition of critical reading as a technique for inculcating secularism is a potent ground for postsecular studies, which Caputo claims should be driven by a post-critical sense of critique, one that is more honest about our inability to separate knowledge from implication and belief. The post and post-secular should, Caputo claims, not be understood to mean over and done with, but after having passed through modernity. A certain iteration of the Enlightenment by another means, he says, with a humbler idea of reason and knowledge. To my mind, such scholarship must be rigorous and critical, yet wary of self-elevating distantiation, making room for compassion in its dealings with the text and with its writer, capable of interrogating and being inspired by texts. This would be a mode of reading which could reach an audience beyond the academy with the joy of humanistic study. For Felsky, such post-critical or reflective reading borrows from phenomenology the willingness to be patient rather than impatient, to describe rather than prescribe, to look carefully at rather than through appearances, to respect rather than to reject what is in plain view, and it assumes that literature's relation to worldly knowledge is not only suspicious, subversive, or adversarial, that it can also amplify and replenish our sense of how things are. It attends, this is still Felsky, it attends to the depth, intensity, and power of our attachments, and does not see scholarly reading as requiring a shedding of such attachments. In positing relations to literature besides suspicion, and in making room for our attachments and enthusiasms, Felsky allows for subjectivities and scholarly practices that acknowledge belief and human faculties beyond instrumental reason. Fourth premise is the linguistic turn. In the early 20th century, Ferdinand de Saussure famously showed that the dual nature of the sign, as signifier and signified, meant that the connection of the sound, image, and concept, that is, meaning, was a psychological event and a function of the relation of the sign to other signs in an endless chain of signification. I should just apologize as an aside and say this is the most English majory, the graduate student Englishy premise, okay? So just bear with me here. I try to make these, I really think that these are 7 major premises that can really be great fertilizer for academic work, post-secular academic work in all kinds of humanities fields, but this one is the most particularly Englishy one, so just hold on. Examining the relationship between word, thing, and idea, philosophers in the linguistic turn followed Saussure in challenging the idea that words correspond transparently to things and concepts. The breakdown of this presumed correspondence let loose a variety of nihilistic and relativistic stances, most sensationalistically the radical arm of Yale School deconstruction, which was not the only kind of deconstruction that there is, but it was the worst part of it that happened. And that wasn't all of the Yale School folks were part of it. I'm thinking mainly of Paul de Man. But much more lastingly, the lesson of philosophy after Wittgenstein, as in the anti-foundationalist work of Nicholas Wolterstorff and Alvin Plantinga, has been that in the most important matters, we all interpret and believe, with reasons better or worse, but never sufficient to constitute proof or to relieve our responsibility for belief, interpretation, and action when we might always have chosen otherwise. Derrida never tired of explaining that deconstruction was concerned not with the destruction of meaning, but with truth and meaning as functions of complex relations of signs, events, and contexts, especially the giving and receiving of credit, and credit being related to the idea of credo, of belief, credit and belief. In a force of knowledge and faith and knowledge, in the force of law and faith and knowledge, 2 of his important essays, the concern for context converges on the subject who thinks and acts within uncertainty. The central insight of this late Derridian deconstruction is that faith and knowledge, configured as opposites in the Enlightenment, are in this formulation bound to each other by the bands of their opposition. That is, the binary by which Enlightenment knowledge defines itself over and above belief is impossible to maintain in Derrida's understanding because faith and messianicity, another one of his central concepts, because faith and messianicity haunt the very nature of language. Caputo expounds on this theme in The Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida in his wonderful little book on religion by insisting on the inescapability of faith in the broadest human sense. Caputo contends that the religious, as both belief from reading to prayer and a deconstructive passion for the impossible, is a very basic structure of our lives. Even, he says, the very thing that most constitutes human experience as such. Religion may be found with or without religion, he writes. That is my thesis. And he implies it will be found whether we like it or not. His work amounts to a deconstruction of the very notion of a secular space purely untainted by belief. This religious sense of life is occasioned for Caputo by the uncertainties of language. Echoing Kierkegaard and Derrida, Caputo writes that non-knowing is the inescapable element in which decisions are reached. We are required to act, but our decisions are covered by a thin film, a quiet and uneasy sense of unknowing. The gay science that the truth of our uncertainty brings for Caputo is a recognition not unlike Ravi's, that we can only and indeed must believe and must believe something. My advice is to attach a coefficient of uncertainty to what we say, writes Caputo, and this epistemological humility crucially guards against fundamentalism and violence, whether religious or secular. At the core of fundamentalism, Caputo maintains, there lies a repressed fear that faith is only faith, and as such, a risk with no guarantee of anything, which is the truth about religion, to which it testifies in the mode of repressing it. Rather than repressing the fears of our involvement in faith and uncertainty, to which the linguistic turn points, a robustly postsecular studies must be invested in owning up to it. A postsecular recognition of the universality of belief amidst uncertainty is a ground for valuing freedom from coercion, whether that coercion be secular or religious. It also actively entertains questions which theory has been begging and foreclosing since the late 1960s. One, whether there are viable ways of understanding the relationship between word and thing other than direct representation and certainty and propositional truths. And by extension, two, whether there are other ways of living and experiencing human existence than as the Cartesian subject of mastery and certainty, with its pandemonium of ills so meticulously elaborated by the Lacanian psychoanalytic criticism of the last half century. Okay, English majory stuff is kind of done. Look at the premise 5 would be, and I'm sorry, my title for this one is clunky. I can't make it any more compact. But it's revised and historical understandings of religions and the religious. So, revised and historical understandings of religions and the religious. So if we begin seeing secularism, premise number 2, that would necessarily be also to begin seeing religion differently, since religion in modernity has been constituted by the logic of secularism. This seeing differently can take one of two forms, either thoroughly inhabiting the category of the religious as it has been constituted under secularism in such a way that unsettles that secular form of thinking itself, or by refusing the way secular thought constitutes religion altogether. Derrida's method in Faith and Knowledge is the first, teasing out the problems and the ways Enlightenment secularism constituted itself and its religious other around the knowledge-faith binary. Such a deep inhabiting of the traditional terms can itself be productive of genuinely new ways of seeing the religious. But seeing religion differently must also mean going beyond the knowledge-faith binary that has organized our thinking on religion since the Enlightenment. A post-secular perspective encourages us to investigate religion as a shifting range of practices and experiences in different times and places. As Hervilliger puts it, instead of looking for signs of religion's demise, we should, quote, look for signs of religion everywhere, especially of its transformation in modernity. 18th century literary scholar Misty Anderson calls for a post-secular scholarship that reads religion in rather than out of history. What religion turns out to be in any given time, place, writer, or text, when not constituted in advance by a particular critical theory, is often exciting and revelatory, as Anderson's work on Methodism and English identity demonstrates. This historical broadening of our understanding of the religious is potentially limitless because of the impossibility of constituting a pure secularity. Sociologist Thomas Luckman, in a lovely 1967 book, The Invisible Religion, speaks of the religiousness of self-formation and social formation in ways that evoke Regina Schwartz's claim to language's sacramentality, that is, that language is always pointing beyond itself. This is Luckman. The organism becomes a self by embarking with others upon the construction of an objective and moral universe of meaning. Thereby, the organism transcends its biological nature. It is in keeping with an elementary sense of the concept of religion to call the transcendence of biological nature by the human organism a religious phenomenon. We may therefore regard the social processes that lead to the formation of the self as fundamentally religious. End quote. Crucial here is what Luckman insists is the objective reality of human meaning-making in the world, as real as sunlight or fusion, and his equal insistence that we recognize the mutual construction of self and society as religious. Premise number 6, the reality of the person. There's going to be some more Christian Smith here. Corollary to the linguistic turn are disciplinary developments that face us with the reality of the person as a linguistic, meaning-making being. The need for correctives to a strictly materialist, survivalistic view of the species has been felt at least since the ascendance of Hobbes's possessive individualist account of the human person, certainly from the time of Darwin, and has only been strengthened in the wake of the new atheist hard determinism and evolutionary biology's adoption of rational choice models from economics. Mary Douglas and Stephen Ney's important 1998 book, Missing Persons, a critique of the personhood in the social sciences, blames widespread misunderstandings of poverty, for instance, on the hegemony of the Homo economicus model of being human, and on the conceptual vacuum around the concept of the person in the social sciences, pointing to the need to account for the extra-rational and non-consuming dimensions of human persons. Personalist theory and philosophy, however, which in the 20th century encompassed work as diverse as the philosophy of Levinas and Paul Ricoeur, the activist religion of Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King Jr., the theology of Karl Wojtyla, the Pope John Paul II, and John Zazoulis, drew on deep roots in European thought to offer an alternative to liberal individualism by emphasizing the person over the individual and community solidarity over atomization. Sociologist Christian Smith, in his important books, Moral Believing Animals, Personhood and Culture, 2003, and his magnum opus, What is a Person, 2010, advances a sociological view of personhood supplemented by approaches from outside the social sciences that eschews reduction to either the physical or the mental spiritual. Smith insists on human beings as rightly understood in light of the complex reality of being what he calls embodied souls, whose knowledge about the world is shaped by their beliefs primarily in living narratives about the origin and the nature of the value or sacredness of being in the world, which we might add is a very literary way of understanding what it means to be human. Embodied souls whose knowledge is shaped through their living narratives. Humanistic and social science work on personhood provides important grounds for postsecular studies in many disciplines, in that it situates believing, poetry, and narrative-making human reality in the world, not as something aberrant in an insentient, strictly material cosmos. Such anti-reductionistic scholarship insists on reading the person and her narrative, her belief, language, relation, and freedom, reading all of that into and not out of its account of reality at every turn. Without dismissing belief as a delusion, it opens up questions about the literary structures of narratives and their negotiation of belief and meaning-making. my last premise, premise 7, the renovation of ultimate questions. Since the 1970s and 1980s, materiality and historicism have functioned in the academy as particularly potent forms of Warner's distantiation from direct textual address. And global politics since 9/11 have, for some, only intensified strategies for avoiding ultimate questions. Where do I come from? What happens to me when I die? What does it mean to live well or beautifully? What is love? As though entertaining these questions, which literary texts pose not infrequently, as anything other than objects of historical inquiry, risks returning us to the naive or bad faith orthodoxies of the new critics, or making us into religious fundamentalists. This assumption of combat between secular neutrality and subjective religious belief, Warner claims, seriously distorts our scholarly ability, quote, to confront such ultimate questions as finitude, mortality, nature, fate, and commonality. Postsecular studies renovates our ability to confront such ultimate questions. If we live up to the insights of the religious turn formulated in the previous 6 premises, then we can engage ultimate questions not as buffered or distantiated selves, but as persons in relation to these questions and the writers who ask them, past and present. Postsecular studies marks the possibility of viewing such questioning, uncertainty, and faith not as a disabling lack of knowledge, but rather as the very condition of possibility for freedom and meaning-making, and as the prime concern of our scholarly and pedagogical endeavors. The freedom made possible by the faith and construction necessitated by language is the grounds for the possible goodness of holding dear love, beauty, art, or the hope for peaceful relation across genuine difference. And the most important things we do, both the beautiful and the maniacally wicked, are such acts of believing and valuing, of holding dear. It's because we could choose otherwise that articulating these human visions of goodness and hope calls to us, if it does, as a potent and fragile endeavor. This is a grounds for advocating for the role of the humanities in culture and education, a role far beyond a bare modicum of business or bioethics deemed necessary to police what is assumed to be a materialist, scientific, and capitalistic economic reality. The nature of belief, knowledge, and their relation, particularly as they concern questions of goodness, nonviolence, and right relation with others, and shaping a self capable of communion, are not just the parochial concerns of a few among us, but they are questions of language and of living in the world as beings who speak, read, and write, beings who make meaning. Religion is sometimes rejected in literary criticism because it's the oldest hat in the box. And yet, critics of the post-secular often chide that one of its main selling points is novelty. A thoroughgoing post-secular perspective, I would argue, frees us from the tyranny of both tradition and novelty, of entrenched certitudes, or the need to triumph over them with the next new critical paradigm. It enables us to re-inhabit old themes and questions, unashamed that we are imbricated in this questioning and uncertainty, and free to do so with the vast variety of postmodern and global perspectives at our disposal today. To take up the ultimate questions in literature with such freedom, yet unencumbered by an imperative to remake the field with a totally new methodology, one has to be comfortable with finally never disposing of these questions, the way a chemistry professor never thinks of ditching the periodic table of the elements. In the words of the Mellon Working Group on Religion and Literature, kind of their manifesto for post-secular religion and literature, this is a long quote from that document, ultimate questions are never answered once and for all. They must be asked, lived, and plumbed anew in each generation. Their answers are profound but provisional, reasoned but necessarily incomplete. They are not quantifiable nor readily assimilated to the Academy's hunger for novelty. Precisely for these reasons, they demand serious study. This is still the Mellon Working Group language. Such study may proceed from thoroughly secular assumptions. Yet engagement with perennial questions has been and continues to be interwoven with a history of significant religious dimensions. To ignore these dimensions is to cut oneself off from much human experience and thought. It is, in effect, to beg the question. Or as Ravi puts it, pondering the implication of Gödel's theorem at the end of a certain ambiguity, quote, "No matter what the axiom system, truth will outrun proof." Or we might add, our linguistic expression. When proof runs out, Ravi, or rather Suri and Ball, tell a story, write a novel, to make sense of their quest for certainty and their coming to belief. Quite a literary and post-secular response.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
We're going to take just a little break of the action. If you're like me, you've been thinking hard for a long time. So maybe just a little break, and then we'll have time for questions for Lori. But I'd invite you, you should all have received Geneva Lecture Series response survey when you came in, along with the brochure. If you didn't, maybe you could raise your hand, and we'll get you one. Please just take a moment to fill this out or start filling it out. We need your help in knowing kind of who came and how you found out about us. If you have any suggestions for future speakers or topics. And on the back, if you want to be on any of our email lists and are not already, so that you can find out about future events, please print your name carefully and your email especially carefully, because every time we do this, we have some that try as we might, we cannot read, and they bounce back to us. So we have email lists for our future lecturers, the Geneva Lecture Series. The core program is for students, particularly but not exclusively undergraduates, helping to discover their vocation. We have 2 weekly book discussion groups for faculty, staff, and students. One on each side of the river, Wednesday and Thursday noons, for international and American students and visiting scholars, an international fellowship, a little course on Introduction to the Bible, special fun events, especially for international students and scholars, service projects, volunteer support, prayer support, financial support. We do rely on individuals and as well as some of the organizations listed for help. So we'd appreciate any help that you can give us. If anyone needs a pen, please raise your hand, and we'll try to get you. Oh. I forgot the pen. Okay. Well, we'll share pens. I've got 3 in my pocket. Anybody? Pass them around. So, okay. Some of you, need to leave. Let me mention that our next lecture is October 4, time to be determined. It's Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. If you haven't heard of him, you soon will. He wrote the book Just Mercy. That will be a joint offering of Geneva Lecture Series, UNESCO City of Literature, and the UI Center for Human Rights. And that will be very fascinating and inspirational, I'm sure. So you'll want to check the Geneva Lecture Series if you're not on our list already. Okay, so appreciate that, and if you'd give it, let's see, do we have any ushers at the doors as people leave, or just give it to Catherine? But let's take some time for some questions and dialogue with Lori. Oh, Mike, yes. I will Excuse me. I will take your questions or comments with the mic for recording as well as for amplification in the room.
This may be more of a comment than a question, but it seems to me that you might be saying that English and literary criticism has made, I think, a major mistake that scientists have made in thinking that they're actually objective in the sense of separating themselves from their work. And at least my understanding of that, one philosophic understanding of the word objective is to know the object. And that maybe both of those disciplines have strayed from that understanding of objective.
I think that would be a fair understanding of the, at least part of what the religious turn has meant, even in like this mathematical novel that I tried to have a literary moment, and it's very abstract, kind of paper about like the ideas that can fertilize new humanities studies pertaining to religion and secularism. But I think that's right, that we realize that our knowledge is situated and contextual, and that none of us has, however athletically we exercise our reason, some God's eye view of reality. And that kind of epistemological humility and the situation of knowledge as something personal, as having to do with a human person in the world, I think is important, yes, in the sciences and the humanities right now. So the question is how to live up to that. The fear is, of course, that it issues in some kind of horrible relativism or nihilism. But I think we have built up a good body of scholarship and really thoughtful humanistic inquiry that says that it doesn't. That faith does, or uncertainty, which are the flip sides of the different words of describing the same picture, does not mean that there's some kind of pure relativism. It means that there's grounds for humility and genuine and reasoned discussion about our best account of what is true in the world. And where we may differ at the end of that discussion at the end of the day. We may come to some unresolved differences in our accounts. But we can reason and discuss those differences through with, again, a kind of epistemological humility. I think that's a really important advance.
Thanks, Lori, for teaching me everything I didn't know about literary criticism. Still trying to absorb it. One quick comment and a question, which go really right back to the beginning of your talk. The comment is, I thought I heard you say that this religious turn in philosophy began in roughly the 1990s. It began 20 years before that, and actually with analytic philosophers, not with the deconstructionists. The question concerns a sort of large issue that you introduced with this story of Ravi and his teacher, which seemed to suggest, at least initially, that there was a contrast between knowledge on the one hand and faith and meaning on the other hand, right? And so I began thinking, well, what about justified belief? Mm-hmm. Do we have this deep dichotomy here, or isn't it more like a kind of continuum? And if so, I was sort of perplexed a little bit about what the contrast might be between a justified belief, maybe a highly justified belief, and faith or meaning on the other hand.
Right. So I want to ask you a question back, Evan. So when you say that the religious turn of philosophy started in the 1970s, are you thinking about the anti-foundationalists, like the analytic philosophers like Plantinga and Wolterstorff, or I was just wondering who you were thinking?
They were doing that, but they were doing a lot of other stuff, too. And
Okay.
In fact, Alston even before that.
And who?
Bill Alston even before that.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to know who you're thinking about, since I'm an outsider, really, to philosophy. So in that novel, I think, I definitely don't want to instantiate some kind of false dichotomy between knowledge on the one hand and meaning and belief on the other. And all of these characters, it's a really interesting novel about certain ambiguity, despite its bad prose style, like I said. Because several of the characters start from this position of passionately seeking meaning and truth, right? And the way that they affirm the passion and the earnestness of that pursuit is that I will not accept anything without proof, right? I need absolute proof to know what is really true about the world, and this is how my life will have meaning. And it's the breakdown of that idea of a final proof and an absolute certainty that makes all of these characters, several of the characters in the novel, moderate, that decide that they can achieve meaning, or that they would have to achieve meaning with by accepting some unproven axioms. And so that's why, for instance, that non-Euclidean geometry becomes so important in the novel, both to the grandfather in the early part of the 20th century and to Ravi as he's taking the class on infinity with his teacher Nico. Because the fifth axiom in Euclid's Elements is unproven, right? It's classically unprovable.
From the other four.
Yes, from the other. It doesn't follow from the other four. So it's got this kind of singular status. And what do we do about that? And it's this idea, and then the fact, that if you don't take all of Euclid's elements, you can have a non-Euclidean geometry that becomes consistent with itself, but leads you to some really strange places, right? And so, does that mean, how is Euclid's Elements true if it's not true in all times and places, right? That's the kind of mind-bending place that the mathematicians and philosophers in the novel come to. Things that are true but not in all places at all times, or the theory of general relativity, how that changes our idea of time and space and all that. And I would say that one of the most moving points in that novel is the moment in which Sani, the grandfather, admits in his conversations with the Judge Taylor, that his belief in the beauty and consistency and truth of mathematics as an abstract, symbolical, system, purely symbolic, outside of reality, but his belief in that is true, is a belief that is unprovable. And I think that's a very beautiful moment in the novel about Sani himself, and he comes to peace with that. I believe this, though it's not provable, and it helps me in my thinking and perception of the beauty of the world. So I'm willing to continue following out and acting on this belief, following out where it leads me, and that kind of a human moment of belief and perception in beauty or coherence or in compassion or several other values, I take that to be deeply and importantly religious. I mean, or post-secular. I mean, this having to do, with a kind of belief that is just indicative of the human condition, where you call on something inside yourself in your way of approaching and perceiving the world first. Recognizing that moment seems so important to me. Sorry, I think I got a little rambly there at the end, but did that speak to what you were? Okay, sure. I always enjoy talking with you.
Well, I just want to say thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you. I think I'm supposed to stand by this thing. I want to do the teacherly thing. I
hope I can be coherent, so I'll just make a stab at it. But you're speaking of the sort of evacuation of personhood. Reminds me, first, of course, of our own political crisis in which money has become a form of speech, and in which persons are being evacuated from decision making. Yeah. And that links as well to questions raised by the Hebrew prophets about the ultimate destruction of nations, proceeding from idolatry, which is to say, in Psalm 135, they have eyes but do not see, they have mouths but do not speak, and those who worship them will become like the idols they worship.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what I want to push to is, you framed this history of ideas within a post-Enlightenment timeline. But I wonder if really what we're looking at is, if maybe there's a way in which what we're really looking at is simply another iteration of idolatry that is being critiqued in its insistence that our materialist and egoistic fantasies of perfection are always deadly. So, sorry for the long-winded question.
Yeah, no,
but
no.
And hopefully it was somewhat coherent.
Yeah. No, there was a lot great in there. A lot in a general sense, like academic and intellectual, but also a lot that's very specifically Christian in your question. And so I always like to kind of point out where and when those parts are happening. I think that that's right. I think both from a more like secular and scholarly perspective, I think we certainly can say that this idea of that we see a misunderstanding of the human person at the heart of and a devaluation of the human person at work in many areas of political life. I think that that's absolutely true, and that is a kind of idolatry, right? I mean, even at its most egocentric, right? When the theorist, Mark Shaw, when he writes about like money as this dream of absolute power and control, like the money as the idea of the blank check, that which can buy everything, right? I mean, that money itself has this allure, and it is the allure of an idolatry, primarily of my own power and egotism. I mean, that's the allure that it represents. And so then on the religious and theological side, we would say the love of money is the root of all evil, right? In the sense of that ability to control all others at a distance and a remove from them, to be able to purchase and control what I want. And the fact that is, at least we have some organizations trying to fight that in our political system and like Represent Us, a very important political organization to plug in, which you can be on, despite whatever your other political leanings are, if you think that it's human persons and not dollars that should be operative in a democracy and be determining in a democracy. I also, your comment made me think a lot of, I just, after coming through Passion Week and Pascha this week, the place in the Gospels where, the religious leaders of his day are trying to trick up Jesus, right, or to trip him up, and they say to him, should we pay the tax to Caesar, right? And he says, show me the coin, and then he holds it up and says, whose picture is on this? And they're like, Caesar. And he's like, well, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. And in the Judeo-Christian context, what is it that has the imprint of God on it? It's you. It's a person, right? So a coin, money, these material things that can be instrumentalized, that's Caesar's, like the real this, but this view of the human being that is so much more valuable than that. It's not instrumentalized, utilized in that way. That's the foundation of the Christian vision, the Judeo-Christian vision of what it is to be human. And that vision of a human person, I think we need that vision. It's, Habermas, I think that's what is the kind of moment that Jürgen Habermas finds really compelling, and why we need to have, in a secular society, religious voices participating. That's exactly the kind of what he would call a religious intuition that can be shared and can enliven or leaven the public discourse, right? With this distinction between what has the stamp of human vanity and greed on it, that's reductive and utilitarian, and what a human person is and can be. And we should use our language and our religious histories to talk compellingly about that, in art and philosophy and literary criticism.
Hi. I don't know if I'm going to use all your terms correctly. I was scribbling quickly. But
that's right.
you spoke earlier about the ritualization of the resecularization of linguistic studies.
Yeah.
And I know others that have dealt with the issues of ritual speak also of liturgy, of the establishing of rituals, others that interact with Charles Taylor. And so if one of the things that we want to cultivate as we care for a society and we interact with the academic sphere, that we want to cultivate a sense of epistemological humility, and we want to construct those, and often we're going to have to look to the next generations and take time for that to happen. Whether I might be hearing you correctly in terms of one application being the advocacy of humanities and the liberal arts within education as a place to inculcate a sense of what is beautiful and beyond, as well as a limitation, as opposed to the siloization of different spheres of knowledge and academics.
Yeah, you took an awful lot. Yeah, I thought you used all the terms really right on. So good for you. Good for you. Advocating for the humanities from this from the kind of the sorts of post-secular premises that I'm talking about here. I do think that that's important, and that you're bringing up that the idea of ritual is really interesting. What I'm most interested in is making us aware of what I say are the rituals of our resecularization. That this is how paradigm shifts, to my eye, happen repeatedly. I mean, since the humanities disciplines were founded in the latter half of the 19th century in American universities anyway, is this, we get to a certain point where we feel epistemologically uncomfortable. I think that, our beliefs and what's unproven in our systems of knowledge start to show at the seams a little bit. And then we have some kind of, see, that was fuzzy, wishy-washy, superstition or religious based or something. And then we have that we resecularize, right? I mean that these paradigm shifts are always marked by this kind of accusation of a sort of fuzziness, superstition, whatever, religiousness, and a new claim to a kind of secularity, secular certainty and knowledge. And so I think if we recognize that is the kind of academic ritual, over generations of shifting criticism, then we could do something different. I mean, and I think that we could do something different. And you're right that trying to think about the shape of scholarship and teaching that tries to say that this epistemological humility is not our shame, but is humanistic pride and glory. We're never going to be free of these questions. We're never going to reach a perfect certainty about them, and this is why they are so important. They are these perennial. They're what makes our life human, rather than something just more basely appetitive or competitive or consumptive. Did that get at what you were? Yeah. Okay. Hi.
Coming from a more pragmatic viewpoint, I'm wondering if there's any way in the current climate in public schools to teach from this viewpoint in a way that would be accepted.
Oh, wow. That's a really
Coming
great
from
question.
an education student, I want to know.
Yeah. Boy, we're at a tough time in public schooling right now, because I think we have such an erosion of a sense of common presuppositions about the world, right? And so I think that we could work our way to ideas about religiousness, but we've got a long ways to go through working through some sometimes simple American ideas about the separation of church and state, right? And what that's based on and what that means, to come to some kind of place where we could talk about religion in a more meaningful way in public schools. We have this, Martha Nussbaum, what does she say, her word for what the misapplication of the idea of the separation of church and state is that we take that to mean complete freedom from religion. Oops, sorry. Or something. She's got a better phrase for it. I'm kind of butchering it. But this kind of thinking, I mean, that belief is something actually pretty inescapable about the human experience and actually really important, right? To have reason and compassionate dialogue with an athletic sense of reason, but with some kind of human community and epistemological humility and compassion, to speak about that as a value, I think would be a big improvement over, I think, what sometimes is happening, which is everything is right. And really, we don't discuss reasons for thinking that something is right or wrong or better than something else, or a preferable way of living, or a more beautiful or just way of treating someone, right? We're kind of scared of those discussions. And so, and our faith in the ability to have those kinds of discussions in our culture does really erode. So it is eroding, and has eroded quite a ways. So I think we all have to do work, right? And our conversations with each other in classes. And I have to say, the more that I teach on the college level about religion and secularism and post-secular studies, graduate and undergraduate, the more compelled I am that we can have civil human dialogue across great differences, and that doing that actual activity is so important. I think in my post-secular studies honors seminar, many of the students there have just reflected, and we have atheists, Christians, Jews. We have such a big variety, and with what amazing honesty and intensity and respect the members of this seminar interact with each other, week in and week out, is very hopeful to me.
Lori, could you follow it up a little bit and give an example from that class, or maybe an undergrad, or any other class, of how the freedom to discuss those issues, how that happens? I mean, do you as a professor speak from a explicitly, you could say as a Christian, we look at it this way?
Very nice.
Yeah, how does that work? How does it work?
To foster that kind of conversation. Well, and part of it is, curricular. It's trying to teach classes that are called Postsecular Studies and honor seminars, and a class I teach the Bible among its readers. So something where manifestly this is part of it, and to have, this is why I care so deeply about this project of taking the religious turn a step further, letting it kind of come of age into something that we call post-secular studies, where we really gather its most potent kind of formulations, and where we can share that with colleagues who wouldn't necessarily self-identify as post-secular, but we can share some vocabulary about secularism as an ideology, about the secularization thesis as kind of a tool that we really need to retool, as it were. So creating a shared dialogue with colleagues, teaching classes that are post-secular in orientation, teaching classes that aren't post-secular in orientation in ways where you mention that when it seems appropriate. But, I think it's so freeing to students. I find all the time to just talk to religious and non-religious students alike, self-identified, to be able to talk about religion in an academic setting. I think that we are really afraid of it, but students are just so freed by it, and they find it so fascinating. I mean, I'll give you an example from the honors seminar this semester. I taught in this class Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood at the beginning. We've kind of gone from the middle of the 20th century all the way up to, we're reading right now The Road, and we're going to read Gilead, so to really contemporary stuff. So we started with that post-World War II moment, the beginnings of postmodernism and post-secularity with Flannery O'Connor and Auden. And we read Wise Blood, and then we read Flannery O'Connor's newly published prayer journal. So I don't know if many people know this, but the prayer journal that she kept while she was here in the Iowa Writers Workshop was just published in 2013 or 2014. I don't have to take a look at the... It was just about a year ago, yeah. And it's a lovely little book by FSG, and it has the actual journal in facsimile in the back. So it's transcribed, there's typewritten, it's very short, and it's just, it's the kind of language that you expect from Flannery O'Connor, and it's just so bare and spiritually searching and honest. And I have to say, of all the texts that I was teaching this semester, I was the most worried about teaching that one. How a novel goes down with people of all sorts of different levels of belief and disbelief and recovering belief or coming to believe in a classroom is one thing, but how a prayer journal where she's like saying, "Dear God, forgive me for being so nasty to that person at workshop," or whatever. I mean, like, you know, it's just like this really, you see someone praying, you know, how off-putting that might be. And the great and freeing moment in that class for me was when one of my students who self-identifies as a non-believer, as an atheist, his hand was the first one up when I was like, okay, what are our general reactions to the prayer journal today? And he said, "I'm just amazed by this book. This just blows me away. I relate to it so much as a writer. But the really stunning thing is that, you know, I kind of have some idea that religious people exist. I mean, you know, like priests and movies and maybe people that believe somewhere out there. But here's somebody walking around on my campus, the University of Iowa, really believing in God and praying." It was like, I was like, wow. I mean, this moment that was, I mean, and not at all to poke fun at it. Like, look at that moment that happens in a classroom, right? That, I mean, suddenly, and you can see other people in the classroom going, yeah, that would be me. I mean, you know, I'm like walking around the University of Iowa campus praying. I mean, like, there were some people that were kind of having that look. But, you know, that our kind of closeting of religiosity, right? Our kind of don't ask, don't tell about religious identity, as though it is something from which we can keep our hands clean, you know, generates a kind of context in which you can get to be 20 years old and in college and go, oh my gosh, people pray. You know, I mean, it's really pretty astounding, and you can work to kind of undo that in class, you know, and I think that's an important endeavor, and you know, and very possible too. I'm sorry, I keep gesticulating and hitting that microphone. Okay, sorry.
I'm sorry. I think that's a great note on which to end. We could go on for a long time, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are great questions.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.